Bashir and Plain Simple Garak are having lunch together while discussing how humans are gullible. Well, Julius Caesar in particular, as any decent Cardigan ruler would have expected betrayal and been ready to stick a knife in Brutus before he got the chance. The meal ends and they arrange to meet later while Plain Simple Garak goes back to his tailor shop. Not for long though, as the shop promptly kabooms while he's in it, though he's fine save for a bit of strawberry jam on his cheek. The investigation with Odo and O'Brien shows a conduit behind the shop was the cause, and Odo feels the same way about coincidences as Plain Simple Garak does. He's right too, as O'Brien finds evidence to suggest an initial trigger explosive caused the overload. Cisco locks the station down to make sure nobody scarpers, and we start trying to find who did it. Plain Simple Garak isn't particularly helpful, as he's insisting that nobody would want to murder a plain simple tailor, not even one that people have made up silly rumours about having previously been in the Obsidian Order. His final claim that he was exiled for fiddling his taxes confirms to Odo and Cisco that he has no intention of being useful. Still, Odo's nothing if not methodical. Plain Simple Garak is being shown a list of arrivals to see if he recognises anyone. He probably won't tell us if he does, but it might give him a chance to solve the problem himself. Or maybe O'Brien has the answer. He's brought some evidence that he doesn't quite understand, something organic around the blast site. Odo thinks it's the remains of a sensor that detects pheromones, something designed to target specific species, and it's rather popular among a race called the Flaxians. By a fascinating coincidence, one of them arrived on the station this very morning. The Flaxian is a merchant of luxury goods, or at least his paperwork says he is. Okay, he was previously implicated in a murder, but that was a simple mistake. You can't blame a man for coincidence. Odo decides to mix a little business with his pleasure. He's looking for a gift, perhaps considering something for Kira, but he doesn't have a sense of smell to gauge which perfume would be best for her, and asks the trader to describe some while questioning him about Plain Simple Garak. A couple of perfumes sound intriguing, so he decides to mix them. The suggestion of adding a third has the trader saying they wouldn't smell particularly enticing, and he's so sure of it that he physically stops Odo from mixing them. What an odd coincidence, as Odo says mixing these three in particular would have created a rather deadly gas, presumably something he learned from scanning the box, and it's fascinating that the merchant stopped him. A coincidence isn't evidence though, so we can't hold him. What we can do is stick a tracking device on his ship and follow the bastard, something that Plain Simple Garak appears to have expected as he's waiting for Odo in a megashuttle. Odo telling him to bugger off doesn't work, and he doesn't have time to waste if he wants to follow his suspect, so off we go. Briefly, anyway, as the ship we're tailing kabooms shortly thereafter. The loss of one lead does at least give us another. The merchant ship kaboomed when it tried to warp away, and the tracking device tells us there was a science wibbly that caused it. That particular science wibbly is favoured by the Romulans. When asked why the Romulans would want to kill him, Plain Simple Garak bluntly answers that he doesn't know. Odo thinks that's the truth, as he didn't bother making some bullshit up, all of which leaves us with an even bigger mystery than we had before. In a surprising turn of events, the Romulan contact Cisco talks to doesn't deny killing our suspect. They'd wanted the guy for a while, so killing him was legit. Who knows, maybe some of those crimes were even genuine rather than paid for by the Tal Shiar. What's that? Tried to kill a cardigan tailor? No idea, mate. Nothing to do with us. Bye. All of which leaves them back at square one, so Odo wants to try a different approach. Rather than investigate whoever tried to kill Plain Simple Garak, he's going to try and find out why. The obvious answer is the Obsidian Order connection, which would normally mean he's got no chance, but Odo just so happens to know someone who might be able to help. One mega shuttle ride later deposits him into a cave, and there he meets somebody who'd rather not be seen, as he's changed his face since last they met. The information Odo receives is a bit of a mixed bag. The new guy can't tell him why the Romulans wanted Plain Simple Garak dead, but it's not the only bit of odd behaviour from the Romulans recently. There have been reports of cloaked ships along the Cardigan border, for example, and rumours of activity with ground forces. The Cardigan military is prepared, just in case, but the prospect of a ding-dong between them doesn't smell right, according to him. And then there's the thing with the unfortunate deaths as well. Plain Simple Garak isn't the only person to have had some bad luck of late, though he's the only person still breathing afterwards. 5 other former members of the Obsidian Order died yesterday from a variety of accidents and health issues. Not impossible, but certainly what you'd call a statistical anomaly, and our new friend here thinks there may be a Romulan connection with those too. This is news to Plain Simple Garak when Odo returns and informs him of the names of those who died. Odo asks if they all knew each other from the Obsidian Order, and Plain Simple Garak's latest denial of ever being part of it is a step too far for him. Odo's not in the mood for that shit because Odo's worked out who planted the bomb in Plain Simple Garak's shop. It was Plain Simple Garak himself. The trader didn't do it because the trader clearly specialized in poisons, and dabbling with other methods opens up an element of chance. Odo thinks Plain Simple Garak saw him arrive and realized what was coming, which is why he detonated his own establishment. Having an already ongoing investigation into an assassination attempt is a great way of preventing a genuine one. Plain Simple Garak accepts that he's going to have to loosen his tongue on this one now, or perhaps decides Odo deserves it after working it all out. Either way, he tells Odo that all the names on the list, and he himself, were associated with Tain, the only man to have ever survived long enough to retire from leading the Obsidian Order. That means Tain is smart enough and devious enough to perhaps know what the bloody hell's going on. That's assuming he hasn't suffered an unexpected misfortune of his own, that is. Plain Simple Garak gives him a call after taking some precautions, and instead reaches a Cardigan woman called Mila. Tain isn't there, having departed in some haste yesterday. Mila knows nothing more save the suspicion that he's neck-deep in shit. Whoever this Mila is, she has some influence over Plain Simple Garak, as she manages to make him promise to help Tain. As Odo insists on accompanying him, it would appear the two are going on a second road trip together. Here's hoping this one doesn't end in another kaboom. We're off to a planet in Cardigan space, specifically a secret bolt hole of Tain that Plain Simple Garak isn't supposed to know about. That gives he and Odo plenty of time to talk, and the latter is trying to learn as much as he can. Plain Simple Garak is more forthcoming than he normally would be, so we get the closest we've ever had to a lore dump from him. Mila, the woman to whom he spoke, is Tain's housekeeper and has been for decades. That she's been around him for so long and has not had her breathing privileges revoked means she's trusted, which makes her emotional response to seeing Plain Simple Garak's face most curious, especially when the rumour is that he and Tain parted on poor terms. Plain Simple Garak even goes so far as to admit that Tain was the reason he was exiled from Cardassia. Odo attempts to ferret out the reason for Plain Simple Garak being willing to help despite the banishment, but it would seem we've reached the limit of what he's willing to share, and he instead expertly changes the topic. A little later, we arrive at the system where Plain Simple Garak thinks Tain may be hiding, though we appear to not be the first arrivals. A Romulan ship decloaks above them and some guests teleport aboard. The expected pooping doesn't come though, and we're instead taken onto their ship, where we're greeted by Tain himself. He and Plain Simple Garak spar a little, mostly harmlessly, if you ignore the bit where Tain admits he was the one who tried to have him killed. Odo, on the other hand, stonewalls the whole thing, an approach that goes some way to impressing Tain. Down to business, then, and Tain explains that he's here because retirement isn't all it's cracked up to be. That's why he involved himself in this joint operation between the Cardigans and the Romulans, the one that's going to go through the wormhole and seriously fuck up the Dominion. Not directly, of course, as they'd get annihilated, but through decapitation. The Dominion might be a particularly potent beast, but it's one that's been set up to have all major decisions made by the Founders, and thanks to our little excursion at the start of the season, we know where they live. That's interesting and all, but Plain Simple Garak wants to know why it had to involve him and his former associates all doing a dead. He's got bugger all to do with any of it. The answer is because Tain doesn't plan on resuming retirement once this is over, and going back to lead the Obsidian Order again would be safer if everybody who knows something compromising about him ceased to exist. It's unfortunate about the mishap with the bomb, says Tain, and he's amused to learn that Plain Simple Garak did it himself. Outside-the-box thinking like that is what made him so good at the job. Such a shame that Plain Simple Garak betrayed him. Plain Simple Garak refutes this, though I note doesn't deny whatever deed took place itself, and cites him being here now as proof that he's loyal. That, it seems, is enough to convince Tain, and he tells plain simple Garak that he can leave. That's if he wants to, of course, as the alternative is to stay, have his old position back, return to Cardassia. Not a wiping of the slate, as betrayal should never be forgiven, but a chance to move beyond it. Odo's attempts to remind plain simple Garak that the man offering him a job tried to have him killed recently fail, and he accepts, but we'll have to wait and see how all that turns out, as we're told the story is to be continued. Oh, I do love a good plain simple Garak story. That's possibly influenced by really liking the character, of course, my personal belief being that a good bastard is worth 50 heroes, but his stories also have a tendency to be the most tangled and Machiavellian, as would befit his backstory. Not all of it hits in this instance, and I personally think the ordered assassinations are a weak link in the chain here, but we needed a reason to get plain simple Garak involved, and the options for that are strictly limited when he's stuck on the station and excommunicated. We do have a loose end tied up by this one though, so I'd argue it balances out. In the episode Defiant earlier in the series, we learned about a fleet being built by the Obsidian Order, despite that being against their rules. At the time, we were led to believe it was for a strike against Federation colonies in the demilitarized zone, an attempt to restart the war. We now learn that it was for another purpose entirely, buggering up the Dominion. And that makes some sense. The Cardigans are used to being the dominant power in that area. Okay, the Federation are making inroads with places like Bajor, but as we've seen time and time again ourselves, Starfleet has no stomach for anything more than stopping each new scheme as it comes along. We're a known quantity, and one that's pretty easy to play at that. The Dominion, on the other hand, sound every bit as scheming and underhand as, well, the Cardigans themselves. Solving that problem before it becomes one makes a lot of sense. Hell, they might even make a net gain from the effort. The Dominion subjugated a lot of planets after all, and knocking that on the head would either create a significant amount of goodwill or sow enough fear to take over a few for themselves. It certainly wouldn't be the first time they've enslaved a whole species. This first strike plan does cause us to ask a few questions about a previous story, though. In Visionary, from 3 episodes back, we dealt with a Romulan scheme to close down the wormhole. If that had worked, what would the repercussions have been for the Obsidian Order and their illegal fleet? It's not like they could have complained to the Central Command or Detapa Council, but it could have seriously soured the relationship between the intelligence arms of the Cardigans and Romulans. Or would it? Is it possible the Obsidian Order were already aware of the plan? Might they even have provided the Romulans with detailed data on DS9 to make the mission more likely to succeed? As we said above, the Cardigans have more to lose if the Dominion come barreling through, as they're closer to the ensuing shitstorm. Maybe the fleet was always the backup plan. Or perhaps the Romulans operate in a similar way to the Cardigans. We know this current arrangement is with the Tal Shiar, the intelligence service of the Romulans, so it's possible the attempt to close the wormhole was from another organization, or even a rogue element within their own. Maybe the people who tried to close it were originally sent to get as much data as possible for the joint fleet invasion, but then decided to show a little initiative. There are enough options to make the two seemingly conflicting plans work together, and you could argue that having multiple plates spinning at once is actually more in keeping with what we know about the Cardigans and the Romulans. Let's end with a lovely bit of misdirection in the episode, because there are a few potential layers to it. When in the shuttle on the way to Cardigan space, plain simple Garak deftly moves the topic away from his relationship with Enabran Tain by talking about Odo and emotional connections. On the surface, it's a way of insulting Odo, an attempt to get under the part of him that he's made to resemble skin by highlighting just how different he is. We know that's a point of some discomfort for Odo, and plain simple Garak is aware that just pulling more lies out of his arse isn't going to be effective here, so he needs a different approach to take control. However, it's also entirely possible, perhaps even probable, that plain simple Garak would genuinely know about Odo's feelings for Kira. He's as much of an observer of people as Odo is in his way, albeit for different reasons. Him using that particular piece of ammunition to redirect the course of the conversation is entirely plausible, a way of shaking Odo by showing that he's not as inscrutable as he'd like to believe. But there is another step to that logic, depending on how we wish to view it. By starting this train of conversation, he's not just creating a distraction, he's making Odo aware that plain simple Garak knows what matters most to him. And that, my friends, is a threat. End of episode.
"Bribe Odo," he said. "We can get the footage from outside Quarks that way," he said. "It's foolproof," he said.
Look, I've already told you I'm sorry.
And what happens? We get locked up for selling that clip of Quark to Morn.
How was I supposed to know he'd start watching it in the replimat?
So now, not only are we no closer to truth, but we've also added distribution of obscene material to our station records.
To be fair, I was right about Odo being bent.
And how'd you figure that?
The bastard pocketed my latinum. Woof.